The brutal wind howled across the frozen landscape of Colorado's San Luis Valley, tearing at Samuel Keller's cabin like a savage beast as the snow piled higher with each passing hour. It was December of 1872, and this blizzard was the worst Fort Garland had seen in years, forcing everyone, trappers, traders, and soldiers alike, to seek shelter against nature's fury. Samuel stoked the fire in his modest cabin, one of several scattered a mile outside Fort Garland's protective walls. At 32, he'd spent the better part of 15 years wandering the frontier, working as a ranch hand, scout, and occasionally hunting bounties when times were lean. The military outpost offered some stability, though he preferred his solitude after years of hard living. He just settled with a tin cup of coffee when a faint sound came from outside, something different from the wind's constant moan. Samuel froze, listening. There it was again, a weak thump against his door. Reaching for his Colt revolver, he approached cautiously. Raiders weren't common this close to the fort, especially in such weather, but caution had kept him alive this long. He pulled the door open, bracing against the blast of frigid air and swirling snow. A woman collapsed at his feet, her body half buried in the freshly fallen snow. Her face was deathly pale, lips tinged blue, dark hair frozen with ice crystals. "Good God," Samuel muttered, holstering his weapon and kneeling beside her. She was breathing, but barely. Without hesitation, he gathered her into his arms and carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind them. "Miss, can you hear me?" Samuel laid her gently before the hearth, adding another log to build the flames higher. Her clothes were sodden and frozen, a respectable traveling dress, now ruined by the elements. Her eyelids fluttered briefly, revealing eyes the color of summer sage before closing again. Samuel worked quickly, removing her ice-encrusted cloak and boots. Her skin was dangerously cold to the touch. "You're staying here," he said firmly, though she couldn't hear him. "At least until this storm passes." He wrapped her in his warmest blankets, then set water to heat on the stove. As the woman lay unconscious, Samuel examined her more carefully. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with refined features that suggested she wasn't from these harsh frontier lands. A small leather satchel was still clutched in her frozen fingers, but he left it be. A lady's possessions weren't his to rifle through. After an hour of tending to her, rubbing circulation back into her hands and feet as his mother had taught him long ago, the woman stirred. Her eyes opened again, confusion and fear evident. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely audible. "Fort Garland, madam, or just outside it." "You're safe now," Samuel said, keeping his distance so as not to frighten her. "Name's Samuel Keller, found you half frozen on my doorstep." She attempted to sit up but immediately fell back, weak from her ordeal. "Faith," she whispered. "Faith Holloway." "Miss Holloway," Samuel acknowledged with a nod. "You need to rest. That storm nearly took you." Faith's eyes darted around the cabin, a simple one-room affair with a bed against the far wall, a table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves holding Samuel's meager possessions. A rifle hung over the door and trapping tools occupied a corner. "The stagecoach," she managed. "It broke an axle." The driver said, "Fort Garland was close. I thought I could walk." Samuel shook his head. "In this weather, that's 3 miles at least." He poured some heated broth into a cup. "Here, drink slowly." As he helped her sit up enough to sip the warm liquid, Samuel noticed a gold band on her finger. "Married then? That complicated matters." "My husband," Faith said, noticing his glance. "He's gone. 2 years now." "I'm sorry for your loss," Samuel replied automatically, though it relieved one concern. A widow traveling alone was unusual but not unheard of on the frontier. "Thank you for saving my life, Mr. Keller," Faith said, her voice gaining some strength. "I didn't think anyone would hear me. Lucky I did. Another hour out there. He didn't finish the thought. Where were you headed? Denver, she answered. I have a teaching position waiting. Samuel nodded. Denver was still another 100 miles north, a journey impossible in current conditions. Well, Miss Holloway, you won't be going anywhere soon. This blizzard's set to last 3 days at least. He gestured to the window, where snow had piled halfway up the glass. You're staying here until it's safe to travel. A flash of something uncertainty perhaps crossed her face. I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition when the alternative is freezing to death, Samuel cut in. I've got supplies enough. Once the storm breaks, I can take you to the fort proper. Faith seemed to weigh her options, though in truth she had none. Finally, she nodded. You're very kind, Mr. Keller. Samuel, he corrected. Out here, formalities don't count for much, Samuel, Faith repeated softly. He turned away, uncomfortable with her gratitude. Kindness wasn't something he was accustomed to receiving or giving, but letting her die wasn't an option any decent man would consider. Rest now, he said gruffly. I'll see about making something more substantial to eat. As night fell fully, the storm intensified. Samuel prepared a simple stew with dried venison and the few vegetables he had stored. Faith drifted in and out of consciousness, her body fighting to recover from the extreme cold. When the stew was ready, Samuel roused her gently. You need to eat. Faith managed a few spoonfuls before exhaustion overcame her again. Samuel helped her lie back down near the fire, then took his own meal at the table. He'd give her his bed for the night and make do with blankets on the floor. As he watched her sleep, Samuel felt a strange protectiveness stir within him. It had been years since he'd had company in his cabin, longer still since that company had been a woman. Faith Holloway was clearly educated and refined, the kind of woman who belonged in civilization, not the harsh frontier where men like him scratched out a living. What brought you out here, Faith Holloway? He murmured to himself as the wind howled outside. Morning brought no respite from the storm. Samuel woke before dawn, as was his habit, to find Faith watching him from her makeshift bed by the hearth. You should have taken the bed, she said, her voice stronger than the previous night. Samuel shrugged. I've slept on worse. He stoked the fire and put coffee on to boil. Faith attempted to stand, wobbling slightly. Easy, Samuel cautioned, moving to steady her. You're still weak. I need to. She gestured vaguely, embarrassed. Understanding dawned on Samuel's face. Of course. He pointed to a small curtained area in the corner. There's a chamber pot there. I'll step outside for a moment. In this weather, Faith looked alarmed. Just to the woodpile, need more logs anyway. Samuel pulled on his heavy coat and hat. Take your time. The bitter cold hit him like a physical blow as he stepped outside. The snow had drifted nearly to his waist in places, and the sky promised more. Samuel gathered an armful of wood from the covered pile beside his cabin, giving Faith the privacy she needed. When he returned, cheeks reddened from the brief exposure, Faith had managed to settle herself at the table. She'd straightened her dress as best she could and attempted to tame her dark hair. Thank you, she said simply. Samuel nodded, setting down the wood. Coffee, please. As he poured the steaming liquid into 2 cups, Samuel studied her covertly. In daylight, recovered somewhat from her ordeal, Faith Holloway was strikingly beautiful. Her eyes were indeed the color of sage, set in an oval face with high cheekbones and a determined chin. Her dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders, and despite her disheveled state, she carried herself with dignity. You mentioned Denver, Samuel said, breaking the awkward silence. Teaching? Faith nodded, warming her hands around the cup. Yes. I've accepted a position at a new school for girls. I was a teacher in St. Louis before. Before your husband passed, Samuel finished when she faltered. Yes. Faith took a sip of coffee. Thomas died of typhoid. We had no children and his family. She shook her head. Let's just say they made it clear I was no longer welcome. Samuel had heard such stories before. Widows often found themselves adrift, particularly when inheritance was involved. So you decided on Denver. I decided on a fresh start, Faith corrected. Denver is growing rapidly. They need educated women willing to teach. My friend Alina secured the position for me. Samuel nodded. It made sense. Denver was becoming a true city, attracting those seeking opportunity without the extreme dangers of more remote territories. And you, Mr. Keller Samuel, Faith amended. What brings you to Fort Garland? Work mainly, he answered, moving to prepare a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush. I do some hunting for the fort, some trapping, guide work when it's available. You live alone. It wasn't a question, but Samuel answered anyway. Yes, suits me. No family. Samuel stirred the pot with more force than necessary. Not anymore. Parents died when I was young, raised by an uncle until I was 16, then struck out on my own. I'm sorry, Faith said softly. He shrugged. It was a long time ago. The day passed slowly, confined as they were by the relentless storm. Samuel showed Faith his collection of books, a surprising number for a frontier cabin, and she brightened considerably. You enjoy reading, she observed, running her fingers along the spines. Passes the time during winter, Samuel replied. Take your pick. Faith selected a volume of Emerson's essays, settling back near the fire. Samuel busied himself with mending a trap, occasionally glancing her way. The domesticity of the scene struck him as both foreign and oddly comforting. By evening, Faith was strong enough to help prepare their meal, moving around the small cabin with growing confidence. The awkwardness between them had eased somewhat, though Samuel remained conscious of the impropriety of their situation, a single man and a widow, alone in a remote cabin. The stage-coach driver, Faith said suddenly as they ate, and the other passengers. Do you think they made it to the fort? Samuel considered this. If they stayed with the coach, likely so. The company knows these routes well. They wouldn't have sent you out if they thought a storm this bad was coming. It appeared so suddenly, Faith murmured. One moment the sky was clear, the next. Mountain weather, Samuel explained. Unpredictable, especially this time of year. You were lucky to find my cabin. Faith met his eyes. Lucky indeed. That night, despite Faith's protests, Samuel again took the floor, insisting she take his bed. As he lay listening to the wind, he found himself more aware of her presence than he cared to admit. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to think of a woman as anything more than passing company in a saloon. Faith Holloway was different, the kind of woman a man built a life with, not the kind who shared a lonely night. The thought troubled him more than it should have. By the third day, the storm had finally begun to abate, though the snow remained deep enough to make travel dangerous. Faith had fully recovered her strength, and they'd fallen into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. You never said why you left St. Louis, Samuel remarked as they sat before the fire that evening. Besides your husband's family, I mean. Faith was quiet for a long moment. There was nothing left for me there. After Thomas died, I discovered he had considerable debts. His family blamed me, claimed I'd encouraged extravagant spending. She shook her head. The truth was, Thomas had a gambling problem he'd hidden from everyone, including me. When he died, his creditors took almost everything. That's a heavy burden to bear alone, Samuel observed. It was, Faith agreed. But it taught me something important. I needed to rely on myself. Not a husband, not family, just me. She smiled faintly. So I sold what little I had left, took the teaching credentials I'd earned before marriage, and decided the West offered the best opportunity for a woman in my position. Samuel admired her courage. Most women in similar circumstances would have remarried quickly or sought family support, however meager. Denver's a good choice, he said. Growing fast, but still civilized enough for a lady. Faith laughed, the sound bright in the quiet cabin. And what makes you think I'm such a proper lady, Mr. Keller? Samuel raised an eyebrow. Aren't you? I was raised to be, she acknowledged. But circumstances have a way of changing people. 2 years ago, I never would have imagined traveling alone across the country, much less surviving a blizzard. Fair point, Samuel conceded. He studied her thoughtfully. Still, teaching school requires a certain respectability. Indeed it does, Faith sighed. And I shall be the very model of a proper schoolmarm once I reach Denver. But here, now. She gestured around the cabin. I think formality has little place, as you said yourself. Samuel felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. No, I suppose it doesn't. The next morning, Samuel rose early to assess the conditions outside. The storm had passed, leaving a brilliant blue sky and a world transformed by gleaming white. The temperature had risen enough to make travel possible, though still challenging. I'll go to the fort today, he told Faith over breakfast. Let them know you're safe, see about arrangements for the next stage coach. Faith nodded, though Samuel thought he detected a flicker of something disappointment in her eyes. How long do you think before I can continue to Denver? She asked. Week, maybe 2, Samuel answered honestly. They'll need to clear the road and the stage won't run until then. I see. Faith smoothed her skirt, now dried but still wrinkled from her ordeal. Will I stay here, or should I find lodging at the fort? The question hung between them. Propriety demanded she stay at the fort, where the commander's wife could chaperone her. Yet the thought of his cabin returning to its lonely state after these days of her presence left Samuel feeling unexpectedly hollow. There's room at the fort, he said finally. Mrs. Reynolds, the commander's wife, takes in the occasional traveler, but he hesitated. The accommodations are basic and crowded. If you prefer, you're welcome to stay here until the stage comes. Faith studied him, her expression unreadable. Wouldn't that be considered inappropriate? Probably, Samuel admitted. Though nobody out here would think twice about it, given the circumstances. Survival matters more than appearances on the frontier. Faith smiled slightly. In that case, I think I would prefer to stay here if it's truly no imposition. You've been very kind. No imposition, Samuel echoed, surprised by the relief he felt. I should still go to the fort, though, need supplies and to check on that stagecoach schedule. Of course. After breakfast, Samuel prepared for the journey. It would take several hours to reach Fort Garland through the deep snow, and he wanted to return before nightfall. There's plenty of food, he told Faith as he donned his heavy coat. Keep the fire going. If anyone comes by, unlikely as that is, the rifle's loaded. Faith nodded, looking smaller somehow in the large cabin. I'll be fine, Samuel. Please be careful. He paused at the door, struck by the concern in her voice. I will. The trek to Fort Garland was arduous but uneventful. Samuel found the small military outpost bustling with activity as soldiers cleared pathways between buildings. Commander Reynolds greeted him with surprise. Keller didn't expect to see anyone from the outlying areas for days yet. Samuel explained about finding Faith, carefully emphasizing the life-threatening nature of her situation. Reynolds nodded understandingly. The stagecoach made it in, minus one passenger they feared lost. Sounds like you're Miss Holloway. They'll be relieved to hear she's alive. When's the next stage to Denver? Samuel asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Reynolds scratched his beard. 2 weeks at the earliest. Road north is completely blocked. Had a rider from Alamosa yesterday, says the passes won't be clear before then. 2 weeks. Samuel felt a confusing mix of emotions at this news. "Your Miss Holloway is welcome here," Reynolds offered. "Margaret would appreciate another woman's company." "She's not my Miss Holloway," Samuel corrected automatically. "But thank you, I'll extend the offer." After collecting supplies and confirming that Faith's luggage had arrived with the stagecoach, Samuel began the journey back. The afternoon sun had softened the snow somewhat, making travel marginally easier. As his cabin came into view, Samuel noticed smoke rising steadily from the chimney and yellow lamplight in the windows. The sight stirred something long dormant within him, a sense of returning to something more than just shelter. Faith opened the door before he could knock, her face lighting up at the sight of him. "You made it back safely." "As promised," Samuel replied, stamping snow from his boots before entering. The cabin was noticeably tidier than when he'd left, and a savory smell came from the pot hanging over the fire. "I hope you don't mind," Faith said, following his gaze. "I found some beans and salt pork. Smells good." Samuel set down his pack and the small trunk that contained Faith's belongings. "They had your luggage at the fort." Faith's eyes widened with pleasure. "Oh, I thought it lost for certain." She moved toward the trunk eagerly, then paused. "And the stagecoach, when will it run again?" 2 weeks, Samuel answered, watching her reaction closely. "The pass is blocked with snow." Faith absorbed this news, her expression a mixture of concern and something else Samuel couldn't quite identify. 2 weeks, she repeated. "I should send word to Alina in Denver." "She'll worry if I don't arrive as scheduled." "Reynolds will dispatch a rider once the immediate trails are clear," Samuel assured her, "and he offered accommodation at the fort if you prefer. Mrs. Reynolds would welcome the company." Faith's fingers worried at the edge of her shawl. "That's very kind, but—" She met his eyes directly. "If it truly isn't an imposition, I would rather stay here, unless you would prefer I go." "No," Samuel said, perhaps too quickly. "No, that is, you're welcome to stay." A small smile curved Faith's lips. "Then I shall. Though I insist on earning my keep. I may be a schoolteacher, but I know how to cook and clean." Samuel wanted to protest that such work wasn't necessary, but the determined set of her chin told him it would be futile. Instead, he nodded. "Fair enough." That evening, they ate the meal Faith had prepared, which was considerably better than Samuel's usual fare. Afterward, he showed her the contents of her trunk, relieved to see she now had clean clothing and personal items. "The stage driver was frantic when they realized you were missing," Samuel told her. "Thought for sure you'd perished in the storm." "I nearly did," Faith said quietly, "if not for you." Samuel shrugged uncomfortably. "Anyone would have done the same." "Perhaps," Faith replied, though her tone suggested she didn't entirely believe it. "Still, I owe you my life, Samuel Keller." "Consider it paid with that meal," he deflected, unable to handle her gratitude. "Best I've had in months." Faith laughed, the sound warming the cabin more effectively than the fire. "In that case, I shall continue to cook while I'm here. It seems a fair exchange for shelter." As they settled into the evening routine, Samuel found himself watching Faith more than he should. There was something captivating about the way she moved, the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet strength she displayed despite her circumstances. She was unlike any woman he'd encountered in his years on the frontier. Later, as they sat reading by lamplight, Samuel with his battered copy of The Last of the Mohicans and Faith with Emerson, he found himself wondering what it would be like if she weren't just a temporary guest. The thought was both tempting and terrifying. The next morning brought clear skies and marginally warmer temperatures. Samuel suggested a short walk to help Faith acclimate to the altitude and weather. "The cold takes some getting used to," he explained as he lent her an extra pair of woolen socks to wear under her boots. "Denver's high up, but not as high as we are here. Best to build your tolerance gradually. Faith wrapped herself in her cloak and followed him outside. The landscape was breathtaking, pristine white stretching to the mountains, which stood sharp and clear against the blue sky. "It's beautiful," Faith breathed, her words forming clouds in the cold air. Samuel nodded. He'd grown so accustomed to the view that he rarely noticed it anymore, but seeing it through her eyes renewed its impact. Different from St. Louis, I imagine, he said, offering his arm as they began walking along a path he'd trampled down earlier. "Very," Faith agreed, taking his arm. Even through layers of clothing, Samuel felt the warmth of her touch. St. Louis has its own beauty, but nothing like this wild splendor. They walked in companionable silence for a while, Faith occasionally stopping to examine animal tracks or unusual formations in the snow. Samuel found himself enjoying her curiosity, her obvious delight in discoveries he took for granted. "What's that?" Faith pointed to a distant plume of smoke rising from beyond a ridge. "Ute camp, most likely," Samuel answered. "They winter in these valleys sometimes, peaceful enough as long as you respect their territory." Faith watched the smoke with interest. "Have you had much interaction with them?" "Some. Traded with them mainly. They're good people, despite what you might have heard." "I try not to form opinions based on hearsay," Faith said, surprising him. "People are people, regardless of their origins." Samuel regarded her with new respect. Such views weren't common, especially among Eastern-educated women. "That's a progressive outlook." Faith smiled wryly. "I've been on the receiving end of enough judgment not to be quick with my own." They continued their walk, eventually circling back toward the cabin as the sun began to descend. The exercise had brought color to Faith's cheeks, making her look more alive than she had since arriving. "Thank you," she said as they reached the cabin door. "I needed that more than I realized." "We'll go a little further tomorrow," Samuel promised. "Build your strength gradually." Inside, they worked together to prepare the evening meal, moving around each other in the small space with growing ease. Samuel found himself enjoying the domestic routine, so different from his usual solitary existence. After dinner, Faith asked about his books again, and Samuel found himself telling her how he'd acquired each one some purchase during rare visits to larger settlements. Others traded for, a few given as payment for services rendered. "You value education," Faith observed. "That's not common among frontiersmen, in my limited experience." "My mother taught school before she married," Samuel explained. "She believed learning was the most valuable thing a person could possess. When she died, I kept reading as a way to honor her memory, I suppose." Faith's expression softened. "She would be proud, I think." Samuel wasn't so sure, but he appreciated the sentiment. "What about you? What led you to teaching?" "Similar reasons," Faith replied. "My father was a professor at a small college. He believed strongly in education for women, which wasn't popular at the time. He taught me himself when local schools proved inadequate." "And your mother?" Faith's smile turned sad. "She died when I was 12. Consumption. My father never remarried. It was just the two of us until I met Thomas at 19. "Young to marry," Samuel observed. "Yes," Faith agreed. "Too young in retrospect. Thomas was charming and well-established at 28. My father had just passed and I was vulnerable, I suppose." "Thomas offered security and affection. It seemed enough at the time." "And now?" Samuel asked before he could stop himself. Faith met his eyes steadily. "Now I know security is something you build for yourself, and affection without deeper feeling is a poor foundation for marriage." The frankness of her answer surprised Samuel. Most women would have demurred or changed the subject. "Sounds like hard-earned wisdom," he said finally. "The hardest," Faith agreed, "but necessary." As the days passed, Samuel and Faith fell into an easy rhythm. Mornings were spent on practical matters, chopping wood, preparing food, maintaining the cabin. Afternoons often included walks of increasing distance, as Faith's stamina improved. Evenings were for reading, conversation, and occasionally music, when Faith discovered Samuel's harmonica and coaxed him into playing. A week into her stay, Samuel returned from checking his trap lines to find Faith had baked bread, a rare luxury in his bachelor existence. "How did you manage this?" he asked, inhaling the mouth-watering aroma. Faith smiled, pleased by his reaction. "I found your flour stores and improvised a starter. It's not as good as it could be with proper yeast, but—" Samuel cut a slice, still warm from the Dutch oven, and took a bite. The flavor and texture were better than anything he'd tasted in years. "It's perfect," he said honestly. Faith's smile widened, and Samuel felt something shift between them, a deepening of connection beyond mere convenience or gratitude. That evening, as they sat before the fire, Faith asked the question he'd been expecting but dreading. "What will you do, Samuel, after I leave for Denver?" Samuel poked at the fire, buying time. "Same as always, I suppose. Hunt, trap, guide when needed." "Alone," Faith said, not a question but a statement. "I'm used to it," he replied, though the words rang hollow even to his own ears. Faith was quiet for a moment. "Don't you ever want more? A home, family?" "Once," Samuel admitted. "A long time ago." "What happened?" Samuel rarely spoke of his past, but something about Faith's quiet presence made the words come easier. "I was engaged, Clara, daughter of a rancher I worked for in Wyoming. We were young, I was 20, she was 18, had plans to start our own place." Faith waited patiently when he paused. "There was a raid. Cheyenne warriors, desperate after the army had burned their village. Clara's father was known for fair dealings with the tribes, but these men were beyond reasoning. They took what they could, burned the rest." Samuel's voice grew tight. "Clara and her mother were inside the main house." "Oh, Samuel," Faith whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "After that I drifted, took whatever work came along, stopped thinking about settling down." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "Hard to imagine that life anymore." Faith reached across the space between them, placing her hand gently on his. "I'm so sorry." Samuel didn't pull away, though the contact sent an unexpected warmth through him. "It was 12 years ago. Some wounds never fully heal," Faith said softly. "They just become part of who we are." Samuel turned his hand, almost unconsciously, until his palm met hers. Their fingers intertwined naturally, as if they'd done this countless times before. "Yes," he agreed, looking at their joined hands. "I suppose they do." They sat like that for a long while, connected by more than just their hands. When Faith finally withdrew to retire for the night, Samuel felt the absence of her touch like a physical thing. The next morning brought a change in the weather, warmer air, and a Chinook wind that began to melt the massive snowdrifts. Samuel knew this meant the roads would clear faster than expected, hastening Faith's departure. The thought left him more disturbed than it should have. "Beautiful day," Faith remarked as they stood outside after breakfast. She'd taken to helping him with morning chores, insisting it was good exercise. "Chinook," Samuel explained. "Warm wind. It'll melt more snow in 3 days than the sun could in 2 weeks." Faith absorbed this information, understanding its implication. "The stage coach will run sooner then." "Likely so," Samuel agreed, unable to keep the regret from his voice. Faith turned to face him fully. "Samuel, whatever she meant to say was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Both turned to see a rider approaching from the direction of Fort Garland. "Company," Samuel observed, moving slightly in front of Faith out of protective instinct. As the rider drew closer, Samuel recognized Private Wilson from the fort. The young soldier reined in his horse before them, touching his hat respectfully to Faith. "Mr. Keller, madam. Commander sent me with news. Road to Alamosa's clearing fast with this warm spell. Stagecoach is scheduled for day after tomorrow, assuming the weather holds." Samuel felt Faith stiffen beside him. "That's sooner than expected," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Wilson nodded. "Yes, madam, thought you'd want to know, being stranded and all." He turned to Samuel. "Also, Jenkins brought in word from the north. Pass to Denver should be clear by week's end." "Thank you, Private," Samuel said. "Would you care for coffee before you head back?" Wilson shook his head. "Much obliged, but I should report back. Commander's orders." After the soldier departed, a heavy silence fell between Samuel and Faith. 2 days. After that, she would be gone, continuing to Denver as planned, and his life would return to its solitary routine. The thought was suddenly unbearable. "Faith," Samuel began, not sure what he meant to say. She turned to him, her eyes filled with emotions he couldn't quite name. "It's good news," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I should prepare my things." Samuel watched her walk back to the cabin, feeling as though something precious was slipping through his fingers. Yet what right did he have to ask her to stay? She had a position waiting, a new life planned. He was just the man who happened to find her in a storm. That night, dinner was a quiet affair. The easy companionship of previous days had been replaced by an awkward tension, words left unspoken hanging between them. "I'll need to settle my account with you," Faith said suddenly, breaking the silence. "For the food and shelter," Samuel frowned. "There's no account to settle. You needed help, I provided it." "I've imposed on your hospitality for over a week," Faith insisted. "I can't leave without offering something in return." "You cooked, cleaned, provided company," Samuel countered. "More than fair exchange." Faith looked down at her plate. "Still, I feel indebted." Samuel set down his fork, frustrated. "This isn't about debt, Faith." "Then what is it about?" she challenged, finally meeting his eyes. The question hung in the air between them. Samuel searched for words that wouldn't come. "I don't know," he admitted finally, "but it's not about owing or being owed." Faith's expression softened. "No, I suppose it isn't." She sighed, pushing her plate away. "I should finish packing." Samuel watched her move to the small trunk that contained her belongings, methodically organizing the few items she'd removed during her stay. Each folded garment, each closed book seemed to widen the distance between them. "You don't have to go," he said abruptly. Faith froze, her back to him. "What?" Samuel hadn't planned to say it, but now that the words were out, he couldn't take them back. Nor, he realized, did he want to. "You don't have to go to Denver," he clarified, standing. "You could stay. Here. In Fort Garland." Faith turned slowly to face him. "Samuel, what are you saying?" He moved closer, emboldened by the fact that she hadn't immediately rejected the idea. "Fort Garland needs a teacher too. The children here have no formal education. Commander Reynolds has mentioned it before wanting to establish a proper school." Hope and confusion warred in Faith's expression. "But I've committed to the position in Denver. Eleanor is expecting me." "Write to her," Samuel suggested. "Explain that you've found another opportunity." "Have I?" Faith asked softly. Samuel took another step toward her. "Yes, if you want it." "And what about you, Samuel?" Faith's voice was barely above a whisper. "What do you want, you?" he said simply. "I want you to stay." The confession hung in the air between them, more vulnerable than any Samuel had made in years. Faith's eyes widened, her lips parting slightly in surprise. "We barely know each other," she said, though there was no conviction in her tone. "I know enough," Samuel replied. "I know you're brave and resourceful. I know you're kind without being weak. I know when you read, you unconsciously touch the corner of each page before turning it." Faith's breath caught. "Samuel." I know I've never felt for anyone what I feel for you, he continued, taking another step closer. Not even Clara, though I loved her truly. This is different, deeper. Faith stood very still, her eyes never leaving his. I've felt it too, she admitted. From the beginning, though I tried to tell myself it was just gratitude or the unusual circumstances. Samuel reached for her hand, relief flooding through him when she didn't pull away. Stay, give Fort Garland a chance, give us a chance. Faith looked down at their joined hands. This is madness, she whispered. Impulsive and illogical and right, Samuel finished for her. It feels right. Faith met his eyes again, and Samuel saw her decision there before she spoke. Yes, she said, it does. The distance between them vanished as Samuel pulled her gently into his arms. Faith came willingly, her hands moving to rest against his chest. I should still go to Denver, she said, though she made no move to step away. To explain in person, to collect my things from Alina. Of course, Samuel agreed. But you'll come back, Faith smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen since news of the stagecoach had arrived. Yes, Samuel, I'll come back. He lowered his head slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, Faith rose on her toes to meet him, her lips finding his in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened with shared longing. When they finally parted, both breathless, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that for days, he confessed. Faith laughed softly. I've wanted you to. The stagecoach departed Fort Garland 2 days later with Faith aboard, but her journey to Denver was now temporary. Samuel stood watching until the coach disappeared from view, already counting the days until her return. The commander and his wife had been surprised, but supportive when Samuel and Faith approached them with the proposal for a school. Fort Garland had nearly 30 children of military personnel and local settlers who received no formal education. We'll have a position and lodging ready when you return, Miss Holloway, Commander Reynolds had promised. This post has needed a school for years. 3 weeks later, Samuel rode to Fort Garland to meet the incoming stagecoach from Denver, his heart pounding with anticipation and a touch of fear. What if Faith had changed her mind? What if Denver's comforts and opportunities had made her reconsider the hardships of frontier life? His fears dissipated the moment Faith stepped down from the coach, her face lighting up at the sight of him. She wore a new dress, practical yet becoming, and carried more luggage than before. Samuel, she said, moving toward him with undisguised joy. He swept her into his arms, propriety be damned, and kissed her thoroughly before the amused driver and other passengers. I missed you, he said when they finally parted. And I you, Faith replied, her cheeks flushed with more than just the cold. Every day. They rode together to his cabin, their cabin now, as Samuel had spent the weeks of her absence expanding it, adding a second room that would serve as their bedroom, leaving the main area for living and eventually, he hoped, children. It's wonderful, Faith exclaimed when she saw the improvements. But however did you manage it so quickly? Had help, Samuel admitted. Word got around that the new schoolteacher was coming to stay. Men from the fort volunteered. Seems everyone's eager for their children to be educated. Faith explored the new space, touching the walls and furnishings with evident pleasure. It's perfect, Samuel. Not finished yet, he cautioned. Still needs proper windows, more furniture, but it's a start. Faith turned to him, her eyes shining. A very good start. That evening, as they sat before the fire in what was now their home, Samuel reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. I have something for you, he said, suddenly nervous. It's not fancy, but... He opened his palm to reveal a ring, a simple gold band with a small green stone that matched her eyes. Faith's breath caught. Samuel. I want to do this properly, he said, taking her hand. Faith Holloway, will you marry me? Tears welled in Faith's eyes as she nodded. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Samuel Keller, I will marry you. The ring slid perfectly onto her finger as if it had been made for her. In a way, Samuel had traded his best rifle and a season's worth of furs to a jeweler in Alamosa for it. I love you, he said, the words coming easily now. From the moment you collapsed on my doorstep, something changed in me, in my life. Faith touched his face gently. And I love you, my rescuer, my future. They were married 2 weeks later in Fort Garland's small chapel with Commander and Mrs. Reynolds serving as witnesses. Faith wore a dress of deep blue that Mrs. Reynolds had helped her alter for the occasion, and Samuel wore the only suit he owned, purchased years ago for occasions he'd never anticipated. The school opened the following month in a converted storehouse within the fort's walls. 27 children of various ages arrived that first day, some never having held a book before. Faith approached the challenge with the same determination she'd shown in surviving the blizzard that had brought her to Samuel's door. By summer, the school was thriving, and Faith and Samuel's cabin had become a true home. They planted a garden together, with Faith learning the challenges and rewards of frontier agriculture under Samuel's patient guidance. He continued his work hunting and guiding, but always returned home to her, no longer content with solitude. When autumn came, bringing the first chill winds down from the mountains, Faith had news of her own to share. "Samuel," she said one evening as they sat on the small porch he'd added during the summer, "I won't be able to continue teaching after spring." Samuel turned to her, concerned. "Why? Has something happened with the commander?" Faith smiled, taking his hand and placing it gently on her still flat stomach. "Because by then, I'll be rather occupied with another responsibility." Understanding dawned slowly, then all at once. "You're with child?" Samuel asked, his voice filled with wonder. Faith nodded, her eyes shining. "Due in late May, according to Mrs. Reynolds' calculations." Samuel gathered her into his arms, overwhelmed with joy. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." "The first of several, I hope," Faith said, laughing as Samuel pulled back to look at her in surprise. "Several," he repeated. "I've always wanted a large family," Faith admitted. "But only if you—" "Yes," Samuel interrupted. "Yes to several. Yes to as many as you wish." Their son, Michael Thomas Keller, was born on a perfect May morning in 1874, with Mrs. Reynolds serving as midwife. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and from his first cry, he held both their hearts completely. Faith resumed teaching that autumn, bringing Michael with her to the schoolroom, where the older girls delighted in helping care for him during lessons. The school had grown to include adult education in the evenings, reading and basic mathematics for soldiers and settlers who'd never had the opportunity to learn. As Michael grew from infant to toddler, the settlement around Fort Garland expanded as well. New families arrived, drawn by rumors of fertile land and the presence of a proper school. Samuel found himself in demand as a guide and instructor in frontier skills, a role he embraced with pride. Their second child, a daughter they named Elizabeth Margaret, arrived in the winter of 1876. Unlike her brother's easy birth, Lizzie came into the world during a snowstorm reminiscent of the one that had brought her parents together. "History repeating itself," Faith murmured as she held their daughter for the first time, snow piling against the windows just as it had 4 years earlier. "With a much happier beginning," Samuel replied, kissing his wife's forehead as he gazed at their newborn. By 1880, their family had grown to include a third child, another son they named James Samuel. Their home had expanded again to accommodate the growing family, with Samuel adding rooms as needed. until the original one-room cabin was barely recognizable within the comfortable family home it had become. Faith continued to teach, though she had helped now 2 young women who had studied with her had taken positions as assistant teachers as the school continued to grow. The settlement that had once been merely an adjunct to the fort was now a proper town, with a general store, church, and plans for a town hall. On cold winter evenings, Samuel and Faith often told their children the story of how they met, how a desperate woman had collapsed on a lonely cabin door, and how a solitary cowboy had opened not just his home but eventually his heart. "It was fate," Faith would say, her hand finding Samuel's as it always did when they recounted this tale. "It was the best decision I ever made," Samuel would counter, squeezing her fingers gently. "Opening that door changed everything," and it had. The lonely path Samuel had walked for so many years had become a road shared, with all its joys and challenges, triumphs and sorrows. The cabin that had sheltered one now echoed with children's laughter and the everyday sounds of family life. 10 years to the day after Faith had collapsed on his doorstep, Samuel took her for a ride to a hilltop overlooking their home and the thriving community beyond. "I brought you here for a reason," he said as they dismounted. "I assumed it wasn't just for the view," Faith teased, though the panorama before them was indeed spectacular, the San Luis Valley stretching toward the distant mountains, bathed in winter sunlight. Samuel reached into his coat and withdrew a small package wrapped in plain paper. "Happy anniversary," he said, offering it to her. Faith opened it carefully to reveal a small leather-bound journal. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the cover. "Open it," Samuel encouraged. Inside, on the first page, she found his handwriting stronger and more confident than it had been when they first met, thanks to her patient teaching. "December 18, 1872, Faith read aloud. "A woman collapsed from cold on my doorstep today. I brought her in and told her she was staying here. I had no idea she would stay forever, or that forever wouldn't be nearly long enough." Tears filled Faith's eyes as she looked up at her husband. "Oh, Samuel." He took her hands in his, still marveling at how perfectly they fit together. 10 years ago, I thought I was saving your life. I didn't realize you were saving mine." Faith leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his as she had countless times over the years. "We saved each other," she corrected gently, "and built something I never imagined possible." As they rode back to their home, to their children, and the life they had created together, Samuel reflected on the strange workings of fate that had brought Faith to his door that stormy night. One moment of decision, one act of basic human kindness, had altered the course of both their lives irrevocably. He couldn't imagine a better outcome from the worst blizzard Fort Garland had ever seen. "Race you home," Faith called, urging her horse ahead with a laugh that still captivated him after all these years. Samuel grinned and spurred his mount forward. "You're on." Together they galloped toward the lights of home, toward the future they continued to build day by day, neither of them ever forgetting the storm that had brought them together, or the love that had kept them that way.